So, folks, to start today, we're kind of going to start finishing up with Unreal. We don't have too much left to cover really on it. We've covered kind of broad areas of the engine. The kind of main things at this stage are like we've kind of gone through a lot of. We've gone quite broad across like lighting, materials, all that stuff. The one thing I'm going to show today is post processing, which is quite useful to put in your vertical slice because again it can just give us what post processing often does is it ties the scene together, like it makes it look a little bit more cohesive and coherent. So that's what we're going to be doing today. It won't take us too long. Here's Unreal. I'm going to launch the project from last week. So we're going to go into like a bit of this sort of thing and kind of seeing some of the impacts we can make on post processing. Beyond that, this keeps opening on the wrong window, so I apologize. Beyond that, I just want to talk you through the next stage of the assignment and just kind of see if everyone's happy with the feedback they got from Jeff. Is everyone happy to get feedback from Jeff? Yeah. I think it seemed like pretty thorough. I think for most people they got a decent amount of feedback like on like the level design and the plan you have. As I mentioned in the Discord, if you got feedback that was like quite positive and highlighted things to change or tweak about the layout, that should be kind of your focus at the minute. Hopefully you've made those adjustments to your floor plan. If you got feedback that like overall was like kind of fairly negative or like fairly like, oh, I'm not sure if this level really works, you might need to do a bigger rework to the design. Now, the goal for next week in the second part of the class, so from this time from 3 to 4, what we'll be doing is a playtest, okay? But purely a playtest of your white box. Okay, so it doesn't have to have any logic or visuals or anything like that. It just has to be the layout of your room that a player can move through. What you're going to be finding out is like the flow of your level, whether players can make sense of the spaces and their relationship to one another, and kind of scale as well and things like that, like how players feel in the space. Does that make sense? Cool. You're going to gather playtest data from that. You're going to make changes, and then we're going to do the same thing in the last week. Okay. They're kind of our focus from here on out. Like level design is a fairly practice-based thing, so to focus on your own levels that you're making and getting feedback from your peers is probably going to have the biggest impact on improving kind of your level designs. I will hope by the time we meet next week, you should have grades for the level design document. Yeah, that's my plan. It's just it does take a while to read 38 level design documents and kind of give them grades and feedback and stuff. That's the biggest thing. Then when it comes to the assignment, I'll put up a brief tomorrow. I think I'll have that finished. What you need to do for the final assignment for the module, the remaining 70%, is you need to create your level as a playable block mesh. Basically, it's just block out textures and stuff aren't important. Materials might be important. So let's say if there's like keys or goals or something like that in your level, or doors that open and doors that don't. Making sure that the doors that open are maybe colored green and the ones that don't are red. You know, like kind of visual language is important, but like detail and realism are not important. Okay, so you don't need to use a fancy texture or asset pack. So you're going to create that. You're going to create your level. You're going to create a video, and you're going to create 5 screenshots of your level showing it off. Okay, and then you're going to have playtest notes. Okay, and these are going to be notes of your design process from your initial concept all the way up to the feedback you got, what you changed with each piece of feedback. Does that make sense? And then just a final evaluation of the levels for them as well.
Yeah, just to clarify, when we're even up to the point when we're recording and taking screenshots of the final submission, do we need to be all functional as we've described, or just move throughable?
So, yeah, that's a good question. Like, should they all be functional? Let's say things like keys, doors, stuff like that should be in there and functional for the video. Because what you're showing is basically level scripting, basically, which is part of like the initial block mesh. It's like how the level will play together. Now, if there's stuff in your level like let's say in an ideal world your level would have some cool like boss spawn in animation or something like that, you can just have like a particle effect or like a scaling animation, whatever it is, something very simple to represent that.
But you still need the actual boss. So
Well, like it might just for the boss you might represent as a box.
you don't need to like actually be able to shoot and kill it.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't need like that sort of level of gameplay mechanics, but you need to be like, okay, there's like
It doesn't need to be functional, but it needs to be able to understand what it's like if it goes.
exactly, yeah. That if there's enemies, there may be, and like their direction of facing matters. You might have them have like direction of facing and stuff. Is that okay? Like more stuff you can put in the better, but I know like the main thing is kind of flow through the level, and really what we're focused on is like gates and things like that. You know, things that are going to stop the flow moving through the level. If it's going to be that like you need to clear a room to unlock the next level, you might just make it that once you kill X number of enemies, that's the key for your door base. Does that make sense? Yeah. And like by kill enemies I mean shoot blocks. Okay, so like you can simplify that stuff a bit. Alright. Any questions on that? For next week is just a pure space you can walk around. Okay. Yeah. Next week is just like taking the feedback from Jeff, creating a block mesh of your level, an initial just walkthrough of it. Okay? So you don't need to have doors or anything like that that open and keys.
What are we doing today then?
Today we go through post processing, and then I also want to just like brief you on the assignment, so you know what's going on.
If in feedback you got just a lot of like alterations, do you kind of redo it and then, or do you should just implement the alterations to the level kind of as in?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Like, should you redo your level design document with the feedback? I think it's probably useful to at least sketch out roughly the changes you intend to make before jumping into the end. But you don't need to redo the level design document. The level design document won't be getting graded again. But I think updating a 2D top-down map with some of the changes and tweaks you're making is useful. But you can also jump straight into engine and set. Any other questions? Cool. So what we're going to show today is post-processing, which is basically the way we're going to like kind of tie our scene together. You probably remember this from Unity as a system that kind of makes things look kind of interesting, I suppose. Now I can't remember where I saved my level, so yeah. Cool. So here's my level. It's acting up a bit because of the like tessellation on like this. This graphics card on this laptop is about 4 or 5 years old, so it kind of flickers a bit when I look at it. But here basically is my scene that we had last week. We're able to look around. We've got our little Christmas tree. And, we've got our particles and bullets. It's still in there. But yeah, that's basically it. Okay. One thing we want to do here is we're going to use post-processing to kind of change how this looks. And the way we're going to start off with post-processing, I think it's easier than Unity. Unity tends to require you like combining a few different plugins and stuff. Yeah. It is. I'll double check. Yeah, it is being recorded. So in Unity, you probably remember you go to a package manager, you bring in post-processing and stuff like that. In Unreal, we can go place actors, we can place a post-processing volume. I'm just going to place this, I'm going to scale this up so that it kind of covers the Christmas tree. Okay, so once I move between the ball and the Christmas tree, I should see post-processing. To test out that it's working, I'm going to click on Bloom here on the details panel. And under intensity here, I'm going to increase this like to something crazy, basically. So here's how Bloom looks in most of our level. Once we go inside here, the Bloom basically goes crazy. That is if you have your post-processing volume selected, and then intensity of bloom here, you can change that so that once we move inside it, the bloom basically goes crazy. You can set that to be a pretty high, well, whatever's the highest you can get to it. Don't know, something like that. So now we should see this quite clearly once we move in here. They are in the details panel of the post-processing volume.
But are they just like everything that isn't like a physical entry? Because it's a parallel and array of things.
Yeah, these are volumes. These are basically things that are represented in space. Does that make sense? Volumes are things you can walk into, basically. So a collision volume is something you could collide with. A pain-causing volume is an area you might walk into that decreases players' health. Does that make sense? They're kind of like they're things you create like manually inside of Unity with like a box collider set to trigger, and then you'd have some functionality in there. These are just kind of pre-made ones. But hopefully, once we walk closer to this tree, you see the bloom. Can you see how the bloom increases once I go inside the volume? That makes sense. So using a volume like this is useful if you're going to have an area where, let's say, you might want the game to get dark or something like that. So if I unpause the game and yeah, okay. Let's go to temperature here. So what I want to do is change the temperature here. Okay, so that's like decreasing the temperature basically takes the color towards blue, increasing it to take it towards red. And now this volume is like, as we get closer to the Christmas tree, it's like we're getting cold. Okay, does that make sense what's going on there? The bloom is kind of messing with the color. This sort of volume is what's used in video games when you go underwater. Okay, they'll have a volume that like adjusts the player like camera perspective and things like that. Does that make sense? That you'll have like basically a volume for underwater anywhere where the player goes underwater. A pain causing volume would just like decrease player health. I don't know if it'll do anything at the minute because there's no. Yeah. So yeah, that's like our basic sort of trigger volume, or sorry, our basic post-processing volume. Now, often what we want to do is actually create a post-processing volume that always affects the game. You know, we want like the player to see things a certain way for the whole game. 99% of the time when I'm using post-processing, I want it to be global. Like I just always want it to affect the player's perspective. To do that, we select the post-processing volume and we can scroll down here on the right hand side. And there's a setting here, I'll just try to find this out, called infinite extent. And if I check that, okay, infinite extent means basically that this is now a global effect, like that this is no longer just within the volume and it will affect any camera in the game. Does that make sense? Okay, that makes it global. In a lot of ways, it's much more straightforward than Unity. I don't know if you remember with Unity, there's things with like we're attaching post-processing profiles and settings and stuff like that, and we're cameras and changing layers. You know, it's quite straightforward to get this set up. But what we have at the minute is horrific. So we might jump up here, and the temperature here, I'm gonna maybe take to somewhere like that. The bloom intensity is way too much. So I'm gonna do quite a small bloom there, so that like it's a light effect, but it's still there. Okay. Now, I could do this. I didn't realize. Hold on a sec. This is gonna make my life so much easier. Yeah, the default bloom in Unreal is actually like quite a strong effect. What's going on here? Yeah, that's the graphics card on this machine, unfortunately. There's my post-process volume. So we can do things like chromatic aberration. I don't know if you remember this from Unity, but I'm going to set this crazy so that you can see the impact. Okay, this is where the R, G, and B values start to offset from one another. So if you can see there, the pixels start separating into like different positions. It's kind of a thing that would have happened on old TVs. If you're like trying to get an old TV effect, you have this chromatic aberration quite a bit. You can also set a threshold, which changes like where does this start. So you can, if you increase the threshold, it will not do it at like the center of the screen, basically. So let's say setting a threshold somewhere there. You can. Oh, sorry, that's blue. I'm changing. Oops. The start offset, sorry, starts to. So I don't know if you can see the impact there of this as we change the value of the start offset. The center of the screen now has none of this, and it's kind of all pushed very much out to the edges. And that's what that effect is doing. It's pushing this distortion only to the edge of the screen. We can do things like a dirt mask, like if we want like kind of some sort of dirt on the screen and things like that. We can look at the camera here. Does anyone do photography? Anyone into photography? Cool. So that's fine. There's like these 3 different settings broadly. If you've ever used like a DSLR camera or something like that, there's kind of 3 settings that affect the photo by and large. There's shutter speed, there is the aperture, and there's the ISO settings. Okay? ISO is basically the quality of the image. It's how like clear or crisp the image is going to be. The aperture is like how much light basically it lets in. It kind of affects the focus. And the shutter speed is like how quickly the image is taken. So if the image is taken really quick, not much light gets into the camera. If it's taken quite slowly, you get like a long exposure image. Have you ever seen someone like doing a long exposure image where they like write a name with their phone or something and it looks like it's glowing letters? That's what's happening there. It's a really long shutter speed and it picks up loads of light as the camera, as the phone moves around. So we can change. Let's let us. We can, let's say, change the aperture, which is going to change kind of our focus for the image, but it's not going to have a huge impact. Change the exposure. We can add lens flares. And we can change the tint of them if we want. So if we want this to be our Christmassy, festive sort of lens flare. Okay, we kind of get that evening sunlight sort of effect on the lens flare. We can change the size of these flares, so we can make them bigger or smaller by changing the what's called the bokeh. It's like a. So I don't love lens flaring games. I've probably said this to you before, but like the reason I don't like it is that our eyes don't ever have lens flare. Like lens flare is an effect of a lens capturing an image. So our eyes don't like, we naturally never see lens flare, but we see it in like captured images. If you're making a game that's designed to be cinematic and stuff like that, lens flare makes sense. But if it's like first person game or something like that that's kind of like intense, I would say like leave lens flare out.
Yeah. Would a lens flare show up if the character's like wearing a helmet?
Yeah, it might do. Yeah, that's the sort of thing. Like in Halo or something like that. That's an example. You might have lens flare in that sort of setting. We can change the depth of field. By changing the focal distance of the camera so that things are like in sharp focus at one place and out of focus somewhere else. Okay, and we can change how much things will blur once they're away from the screen and how much they're going to blur by. And if we press play on this, yeah, you can see there are certain things once we get too far away from something, it'll start to blur at the edges. Oh, there goes my floor. Okay, and that's what the depth of field is doing. Have you ever seen tilt shift photography? It's like if someone takes a picture, kind of normally it's from up high, of like traffic moving, and it looks like they're tiny miniature people in cars. That's by adjusting the depth of field basically in the image. It changes the way like kind of the blurring is happening around the edges. It looks like everything's tiny and miniature. Okay? So that's a use of depth of field. Now color grading is, I think, quite important, and you can do this by temperature or color, and you can change the tint as well. So we can, like, by doing some color grading, we can change like very much how this image feels. Okay, so that color grading probably makes us look like kind of like a warm, I would call that like a warm winter sunshine, if that makes sense. Like it's like you're kind of winter evening, but it's kind of still like feels mild. As you change the color temperature, the image now starts to feel, once you go to like the blues, it starts to feel like much colder and cooler. Does that make sense? The temperature of our image kind of affects how we perceive, how we think the level would feel. So if you're doing like a snow level or something like that, I would say definitely color grade towards the blue end of the spectrum. If you're doing something set on like a volcano or something like that, color grade towards the warm end of the spectrum. Does that make sense? It's basically a way to kind of change the way that feels. We have control over some of these settings as well. So if I just gonna turn that off for a second. We can change the color saturation of our image. Okay, I don't know if that's showing up that way. Yeah, cool. So we can make the colors saturate into different parts of the image to find something we think actually is going to look really well for it. Okay, so let's say we think that's going to be good. We can adjust the contrast. Okay, so we can go for something like that that makes it look a little bit more like, I don't know, sci-fi Christmas. But basically by adjusting these color tints, we've got a lot of control over how our image is going to look. We can increase the slider here for contrast. And that means the intensity of contrast is going to be brighter, so like colors are going to pop a bit more and stuff. We can change the way, even though we don't have much shadows, we can change like the color of our shadows so that our shadows maybe pick up a different color, different darkness or intensity. We can create ambient occlusion here, which generally I would recommend putting in. This is where you'll hopefully be able to see this on the monitor on the screen. But if you look here where the tree meets the ground, that's where we should see the ambient occlusion happen, and it's where two surfaces meet. In real life, we normally get a darkening at that joint. Does that make sense? Okay, so low ambient occlusion, high ambient occlusion. Okay. Generally, it looks quite nice. It gives quite a nice effect. It means where surfaces join, you get the sense of that, like there's an actual physical shadow and a physical join there. If you don't have that, sometimes it looks like two 3D models plonked on top of each other with no interface between each other. We could change like the global illumination, which is like how indirect light. I don't know if there's much indirect light in this level, so it won't have much of an impact. But that's like kind of bounce light, how that's affecting our level. We can look at motion blur. So by default, Unreal has like a high degree of motion blur. We can decrease that. And now we should see like things when we move, we don't get as much motion blur. As we increase the value, we move around, we should see the motion blur increase. So I'll set that to maximum. And we'll press play. Okay, can you see the motion blur effect there? Like it's kind of, everything is blurring quite a lot. can set that to 0. We're not really getting that effect. Everything's staying pretty sharp there. Not. Does that make sense? Is cool. There's one thing I meant to show up here, which is film grain. Cool. In this image effects section, which I kind of breezed through, like I didn't look into it, but this has a few of the effects we'll use a bit as well. So one of them is vignette. So vignette basically darkens the edges of the image. Can you see that effect there? I really like vignette as effect. Some people hate it, but just like it's kind of personal preference. We can add film grain. So that's what film grain does. We can increase or decrease the jitter, which is how much it's moving by. Generally, if you're doing film grain, it's like do a light effect. It can be kind of nice. It can kind of like make the image look a little bit artificial or something like that. So for certain games, especially if you're doing a horror game or something like that, stuff like film grain, stuff like lens blur, stuff like chromatic aberration, all those things are things you'll see in horror games quite a lot. And depending if it's like a strategy game, you won't see that stuff at all because it's all about clear communication of information. So we can play our scene now. Cool. And I think the effects we've added generally make this look like a pretty cool scene compared to what it started out as. So I'll like turn off this effect in a second. But I think it makes the scene look a lot more kind of cohesive and kind of just a bit more interesting to look at. And to show what the scene looks like with it off, I'll just navigate this to... Oh. That's it. And then if we turn this off, that's what it looks like without it. Okay, so we go from a scene that looks like, I think, pretty like flat and uninteresting to a scene that has a bit more detail, even though this is still flat texture, because we've got the film grain and actually looks a little more interesting. We've got our ambient occlusion, which is kind of much more pronounced there. Our color grading, I think, helps make the colors pop and stuff as well. The lens flare I would probably take away if I was like designing this as a level. But that's probably really the only thing about it. And like I might decrease the blueness by a bit much. But overall we're able to create quite a nice effect without too much work. Like, and it's all just, to be honest, post-processing in my experience is very much like just playing around with things, noodling with sliders until you find something you like. Yeah, that's basically it. And actually, the one thing I want to see is... Oh, no. Yeah, cool. That's fine. And, like, we can always, if we want, set this back to... Actually, that's how we can see the difference between them. So if I turn off infinite extent and press play, we can see this is our starting level. And once we walk in here, all the image effects are applied. Yeah, I think so. Are there any questions on that? That is the image effects. That's the final thing that's going to like pull your level together and really make it feel like one cohesive level as opposed to like something that's kind of like just bits and pieces. Some of the things I'd recommend doing in your level, try and keep the geometry quite simple. I'm actually going to jump to the internet for a second. So, cool. So there's some examples here online of like block mesh that you can see. So again, block mesh is all about keeping things very simple. Simple geometry, simple shapes. Why do you think here the steps and stuff are a different color to the terrain? Yeah, it's just to highlight that they're there. We like when this is the final game, the steps will probably be textured some sort of like brick color, and then that'll be like muck or dirt around them basically. So it's to make clear kind of how it's going to look. Okay. Do you remember why we use the grid pattern sometimes in our block mesh? You see it on a lot more. Yeah, since it's a scale, it shows that you're moving. Like a 4-year group that we're doing, like we're doing a game where you're like racing different types of like balls basically against each other. And like they initially had a level that was like, and it was just grey box, basically no texture on it. And like it felt like you weren't really moving, you were just like on a plane. And as soon as they put on textured with like a grid pattern on it, you could see, oh yeah, that's how fast I'm going. Do I need to increase the speed? You know, you get a much better sense of that sort of thing. So it gives you a sense of that. It can be quite like simple, your block mesh. It doesn't need to be anything. I don't know why that's not loading. Like, it's cool if it looks as polished as that, but for most people, that's not how like the block mesh will look. That is normally a step later where the 3D artists do an initial sort of rough mock-up models to place in the scene to replace the default art that the level designers made. But using the default materials and textures and stuff like that come with Unreal, it's totally fine. It doesn't create any issue. What do you think about this as a block mesh? Which? The currently selected one, sorry, yeah. So the geometry is simple, but actually I think one of the things that's going on is like it ends up being like a bit busy or noisy, like it's kind of hard to enjoy that scene, like it looks kind of gross. So I would say like they could probably take down the texture intensity, and I don't know if like this whole blue area, I don't think needs to be quite so blue, and I think it would actually look better if it was like a plain white, basically, or like a grey, because at the minute it's a bit much. Yeah, you can Google block mesh. You'll see things in tons of different levels of detail and stuff. But at its basic level, I think that this communicates the layout and the between the scene much better than the previous one. What I'd say is like this would actually look a little bit better if there was some post processing on it. If there was some ambient occlusion with just like nice shadows and stuff here and like depth of field and stuff, we'd have a better perspective for how far away some of the things are. Does that make sense? Okay, so some of those effects can pull things together. Are there any questions on that? No? Cool, so we're going to leave it there. For next week, okay, have your block mesh done, as in like this sort of level of the ability to walk around the scene. You don't have to have doors that can unlock. If that's a thing you want to do, you can totally do it. But what I would say is first, make sure you've got the entire scene built and that you can walk around it, and then push yourself to add the interactivity in. Sometimes what people do is they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to create the scene, I'm going to have the ability to open doors, and they start like doing the blueprints for opening doors. And before they know it, it's next week and they don't actually have a level that's fully playable. They just have a couple of doors you can walk between. So the goal for next week is we're all going to go for a walk in your different levels. Okay. If you're working on a desktop at home, just put the level up on like OneDrive or something like that so that you can open it on Unreal and the machines in here. Is that okay? We're going to be doing the testing. Is that alright? If anyone can't be in for any reason, we can try and set Parsec up. It's just it often doesn't work great for playtests. There's sometimes issues. But we can try it out and see if it will work. Okay? At the start of next week's class, the first hour, we'll be talking a little bit about like playtesting and how we formally playtest levels. You'll all be setting up playtest surveys so that once someone plays through your level, you're going to get data from them that helps inform the next stages of your level. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Nope. Right. So we'll see you next week, folks.